Something extraordinary is unfolding in Washington right now, and for once, it isn't being driven by Democrats. For the first time, resistance is rising from within Donald Trump's own party. Quietly, deliberately, Republican lawmakers are moving to slow and block the concentration of power Trump appears determined to claim at any cost. Emergency declarations are multiplying. War-level language is escalating. Behind closed doors, anxiety is spreading. Congress is stepping in, not for theater, but to draw a boundary. This isn't a routine political clash or another fleeting headline. It's a fundamental test of whether American power is restrained by law or dictated by one man's impulses. Stay with me to the end, because what's happening now could permanently reshape how power operates in the United States long after the news cycle moves on. Picture Washington late at night. Phones lighting up across Capitol Hill, aides whispering urgently in hallways, senators refreshing their screens, rereading messages to make sure what they're seeing is real. Because the President of the United States is furious, not at Democrats, not at the press, but at members of his own party. And for the first time in years, the challenge isn't coming from protesters outside the gates. It's coming from inside the walls. That's where danger truly begins. Republicans are pushing back against Donald Trump. And no, this isn't standard MAGA infighting or anonymous leaks meant to rattle donors. This is something colder, deeper, and far more consequential. It targets the one thing Trump believes he cannot afford to lose: unchecked authority. This revolt isn't just about broken promises, though there are many. No new wars, lower costs of living, long-promised disclosures that never seem to arrive. What makes this moment different is that Republican lawmakers themselves are actively challenging Trump's ability to wield power without restraint. And when internal guardrails activate, presidents rarely respond with calm. They escalate, they dramatize, they invoke crisis. That's exactly what we're witnessing now. A presidency leaning hard into spectacle and emergency language to prevent internal collapse. At the center of this backlash is an uncomfortable truth that even seasoned Washington veterans hesitate to say aloud. The President of the United States has openly entertained the use of military force in scenarios that could drag America into conflict, not with distant enemies, but with its own allies. When Senator Chris Murphy spelled this out bluntly, it landed like a shockwave. Because once the branding and bravado are stripped away, what remains sounds absurd. Until you remember, these statements can no longer be dismissed as jokes. Greenland isn't empty territory. It belongs to Denmark. Denmark is a NATO ally, and NATO's foundation is collective defense. Any military action against that land isn't symbolic. It's a legal and strategic nightmare that could theoretically place the United States in direct conflict with Europe. The fact that lawmakers now feel compelled to explain this publicly is itself alarming. No American voted for a presidency that flirts with war against allies over land acquisition rhetoric. Yet here we are, parsing hypotheticals and watching members of Trump's own party quietly but decisively try to shut the door before it's kicked open. To understand the backlash, you have to understand Trump's worldview. He doesn't see geopolitics as alliances, treaties, or shared security obligations. He sees leverage, property, deals that can be forced if pressure is applied. That approach might succeed in a boardroom. In global politics, it gets people killed. Republican senators understand this. They know that once military action is framed as an option, the machinery starts moving, whether Congress approves or not. That's why the War Powers Act has suddenly become the front line. Not as a theoretical constitutional debate, but as an emergency brake. And when Republicans joined Democrats to advance a resolution limiting unilateral action, Trump didn't respond with persuasion. He responded with rage, profanity, threats, because that's what happens when someone who believes power is personal discovers it's conditional. The reported phone call to Senator Susan Collins wasn't about a single vote. It was about the shock of realizing loyalty has limits, that even within his own party, some lines can't be crossed. For Trump, that resistance feels existential. His second-term strategy depends on projecting inevitability, dominance, and control. Nothing undermines that faster than members of your own party saying no, especially when the issue is war, authority, and constitutional restraint. Faced with resistance, Trump doesn't retreat. He reframes. He reaches for emergency language, using extraordinary measures not just as policy tools, but as political weapons. The national emergency tied to Venezuelan oil assets fits perfectly into this pattern. It allows him to cast himself as the sole defender of national security while portraying lawmakers as obstacles, even though the reality involves long timelines, massive corporate interests, fragile infrastructure, and benefits that flow primarily to multinational energy companies, not ordinary Americans. But complexity has never been the point. Dominance is. Emergencies centralize authority, they suspend debate, they redirect attention, and few questions are more dangerous to this administration right now than why promised transparency has stalled, why document releases are delayed, and why bipartisan pressure, not executive initiative, has driven oversight forward. When lawmakers like Sheldon Whitehouse openly discuss inspectors general, compliance failures, and missed deadlines, it signals something critical. Not guilt, not accusation, but concern that process itself is breaking down. And that concern is exactly what Trump cannot afford. His political survival relies on flooding the zone, keeping every controversy competing for attention until accountability suffocates. That's why these threads aren't separate stories. The Republican revolt, war powers, emergency declarations, stalled disclosures. They're the same story viewed from different angles. A presidency trying to outrun oversight by accelerating chaos. Republicans who once waved everything through are now calculating the cost of silence, weighing institutional damage against party loyalty, realizing that if they don't act now, they may not recognize the system later. Because when a president openly suggests he is guided by personal judgment rather than law, treaties, or precedent, the issue stops being partisan. It becomes structural. Behind closed doors, Republicans are asking themselves whether stopping Trump is betrayal or preservation. History doesn't remember who tweeted the loudest. It remembers who intervened when the rules bent past their breaking point. As this rebellion deepens, the real story shifts from Trump's public statements to Republican actions behind the scenes. Quiet coordination, careful votes, deliberate distance. The war powers resolution didn't advance by accident. It was a calculated move by lawmakers who understand that if unilateral military threats become normal, Congress becomes irrelevant unless it reasserts itself. Trump's response, intimidation, profanity, political threats, only reinforced those fears. It exposed a decision-making process driven less by strategy than by impulse and legacy obsession. Legacy matters here. Trump wants to be remembered as dominant and transformative, but that myth collides with reality when military rhetoric undermines the promise of no new wars. Wars aren't abstract to voters. They have costs, consequences, and Republicans facing re-election know no branding can sell a conflict with allies as a victory. Emergency powers now feel less like leadership and more like panic. They bypass debate, marginalize dissent, and recast oversight as sabotage. This tactic isn't new. History is full of leaders who reach for emergencies when authority slips. The Venezuelan oil declaration is a textbook case. Economic assets framed as security imperatives, optics prioritized over feasibility. Meanwhile, lawmakers see the distraction for what it is, a narrative pivot away from internal revolt and growing scrutiny. Trump doesn't want support, he wants submission, and when senators assert independence, he treats governance as betrayal. That contradiction reveals fragility. Power built on fear eventually turns inward. Republican senators are now quietly comparing notes, deciding when to draw lines once considered unthinkable. Their concern isn't ideological, it's constitutional. Precedents outlive presidencies. Once norms collapse, they don't magically return. Oversight doesn't rush, it accumulates. Inspectors general don't deal in tweets. They deal in records, timelines, paper trails, and those don't disappear. That's why this moment feels heavier than previous scandals. It's no longer about what Trump says. It's about what he can't fully control. Ultimately, this isn't about one vote or one emergency. It's a reckoning over whether institutions still function when pressure comes from the top. Resistance is no longer purely partisan. It's procedural, institutional. Lawmakers may disagree on policy, but they increasingly agree on one truth. Power justified solely by personal will eventually destroys the system that legitimizes it. Trump senses this shift, which is why his rhetoric grows sharper, more apocalyptic. Leaders who feel control slipping don't slow down. They accelerate. They demand loyalty. They insist only they can prevent collapse, even as their actions fuel instability. That paradox defines this moment. A presidency boxed in by process, a party torn between alignment and survival, institutions forced to decide whether they still function when it matters. This isn't just political drama, it's a stress test of democracy itself. Because systems don't fail overnight, they erode until someone finally says no. Right now, that no is coming from within. And whether it holds will shape not just this presidency, but the limits every future president inherits. That's why this moment matters, why it demands attention beyond outrage. Because democracy doesn't defend itself. It depends on people willing to defend it when it's inconvenient. And that defense, quiet or loud, is the real story unfolding behind the headlines.